it gets crowded, but.
Oh, wait, can
Yeah.
I do it? Will
Yeah.
you make Elana Rabishaw co-host so I can share my screen, please?
Of course.
Thank
Really?
you.
Yeah, I think
There you go.
people have been going out so much.
Share screen. There we go.
So, I forgot to show, the show.
We have
So are you going to the Feeling Groovy concert on Sunday?
And
Yeah.
Rabbi will be live in probably about 20 seconds.
You're going? I guess you
Sure.
are.
Is it here?
Yeah,
Is it here?
It's here.
yeah, it's here. It should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I got my ticket, yeah.
Yeah, every year, I know you're a relatively new member, so every year we partner with Congregation B'nai Israel, which is the Reform Synagogue down the road,
Oh,
in partnership and partner in memory of cantor Stephen Dubov, who was a cantor in the area who died unexpectedly about 16 years ago. And so every year at this time we do a concert. Last year it was Dan Nichols, who is like a very campy, folky singer-songwriter. This year, Cantor Lori is bringing in a friend and highlighting the cantors in the area. So it should be a lot of fun, and it's in memory of Cantor Dubov.
what do they do with the money?
I believe, Aileen, do you know what proceeds go to for the Dubov concert?
Not without looking at the website.
That's my response also.
That's a great response.
So welcome to Lunch and Learn Part 2 on the Abraham Accords. For those who were not
Before
here.
you continue, if you're gonna face that way, I'll move over there.
Yeah, I'll face that way. Let me also close the door to the basement garden.
You don't come to lunch with it? Do you know that?
I know, I got calling here and I didn't know about it.
Oh, it's a single person.
So last week, for those of you who were here, I talked about the Abraham Accords, which was a normalization agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Bahrain, and how that impacts the US-Israel relationship and the relationship between Israel and her neighbors. And I taught that through the lens of the mission that I went on over the summer, which was to Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Manama, Bahrain.
Wow.
And I went as part of a delegation of rabbis across denominations and across the country, and we went as guests of the Emirati government to celebrate the Abraham Accords, which, given the fact that when the Abraham Accords were signed in 2020, we were still deep in COVID. And so now we're coming out of COVID and we're starting to celebrate the Abraham Accords and have conversations about the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and questions about if Saudi Arabia is going to join the Abraham Accords, or as some of my friends who work deep in Israeli government and in those spaces would say, well, Saudi Arabia is a big country. They wouldn't want to join the Abraham Accords. They would want something bigger and better. But the questions that were happening over the summer were, what would a normalized relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia look like? And that was huge, because if Saudi Arabia and Israel have a normalized relationship, and Israel has a normalized relationship with the United Arab Emirates, that means that Israel has normalized relations with two of the biggest Arab countries in the world. And previously, the conversation had been was that the order of operations needed to be that Israel was going to work on the relationship with the Palestinians, and that conflict needed to be resolved first. And in 2020, what was so monumental was that the United Arab Emirates said, actually, we're gonna let you put the US-Israel relationship to the side, and we're going to work on our relationship separately. And that was a really large conversation, and that was really powerful from the global stage because it started to normalize Israel as a player on the global stage and as a partner in moving forward. And then we have October 7th, and that's where the conversation of today is going to take us, which is, so what exactly has happened to the Abraham Accords since October 7th? And I thought about a number of different ways to do this course, and where I landed was I wanted to bring two different articles, might be three, with scholars in the field who have really are experts on these relationships and on international relations, and they know a lot more than I do. And so I brought two articles forward, and we're going to talk about different quotes and different points of what they're saying and sort of broaden it out, but feel free to interrupt me, to ask questions. And that should all be good. Aileen, did I mess up? Should I have pushed like stream, or did you do that?
I've already taken care of that. Thank you, Rabbi.
Amazing, amazing. Sometimes, I know for Torah study, I have to do it and I always forget, which is good to remember and good to have a wonderful teammate in Aileen. So in November of 2023, Gerald Fierstein wrote an article in The Hill. And Ambassador Fierstein is the Middle East Institute's program director on the Arabian Peninsula Affairs and is a former U.S. State Department Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, which is to say that he knows a whole lot more about this topic than I do. And as somebody who worked for the State Department, he brings a wealth of analysis that I thought was really powerful. And this was an article that I read when it came out in November, then I reread in preparation for today. And I think that there's a lot to be said about what was happening 4 weeks into the war and now where we are sitting, which is 4 months into the war. So the big question 4 weeks into the war was, well, what's going to happen the day after? And if you were to be in Israel right now, and if you were to talk to a whole bunch of Israelis, that would be a question that they have also, which
This
is
is the day after the war ends.
correct. So, God willing, Hamas loses its capabilities to be a terrorist organization. What's going to happen next? And what is the relationship between Israel and her neighbors going to look like under the presumption that these relationships have been tested for the last several months. And so in this article, one almost certain casualty of the Hamas terrorist attack is the normalization process between Israel and her neighbors. So this is saying that what we already know, which is that when Israel was attacked on October 7th, and then she fought back and went to war, this relationship is going to be tested. And what Ambassador Fierstein is saying is that actually the relationship between Israel and her Arab neighbors is a casualty, that this is something that perhaps is going to be gone by the time the war is over. And what is really important for me to say is that I'm going to bring a couple of different perspectives. So this is just one perspective. And the reason why Ambassador Fierstein said that one casualty of the Hamas terror attack and from the war is that the relationship is going to be gone is because as originally conceived, Israeli and US leaders believed an outside-in approach would allow Israel to normalize its relations with the Arab world while sidestepping the conflict with the Palestinians. Which is true. That was sort of the idea, was that the United Arab Emirates and Morocco and Bahrain were saying, we're gonna give you time to deal with the relationship with the Palestinians separately, but we know that the social, the economic, the technological pluses for us to have a relationship with you supersedes the fact that we have been saying that you're gonna need to rectify the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians first. So that's challenging when the Arab neighbors are seeing their brothers and sisters suffering and at war with Israel.
Could I?
Yeah.
So, I would just mention that none of the Arab, this, I was reading this morning, where none of the Arab states would take in any of the Palestinians.
Correct.
So that's the first thing. And second thing is the United Arab Republic has a relationship with Israel and depends on Israel and has learned so much about war desalinization and all the things that so I don't know to agree altogether with this gentleman who knows a lot more than I do, because they depend on Israel and have this relationship, so.
Oh, I hear what you're saying. We're gonna get there. I have about 10 slides.
Okay.
No, so, but you're spot on, which is that since 2020, especially the United Arab Emirates and Israel, they have had insane partnerships on the technological thing, in the technological space and in education, with this idea and this understanding that there's a lot more to gain from this partnership than is to be lost. There's a lot more benefit in having this relationship than not, especially when looking at the fact that none of the Arab neighbors are taking in Palestinians. And so it's important to know that there is this little bit of a double standard where Israel is being told that they can't protect their existential right to exist, but then nobody's really stepping up to
Help the person.
right, to come up with a better option. So then what Ambassador Fierstein says is, but an end to the initial conceit of the Abraham Accords does not mean an end to the essential role that the Abraham Accord partners can play in help
Rabbi,
that, yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you for a moment. I thought the thing went mute, so we're all good. Thank you. Proceed.
Oh, it says my internet connection is unstable.
That would explain it.
Which is to say that one of the most important pieces of the Abraham Accords that was reiterated time and time again when I was in the Emirates and in Bahrain was that the goal of the Abraham Accords was to be able to withstand things like this. Nobody was under any illusion from 2020 that by signing the Abraham Accords, miraculously, there was going to be no more war, and this was going to be the be-all and end-all to peace in the Middle East. Now, some people in the summer were saying once Saudi Arabia signs on to normalized relations, that perhaps there is more to be said, because if Saudi Arabia and the Emirates both are in favorable partnership with Israel, then perhaps there is reason for changing the U.S.-Israel
Your audio is going in and out.
Yeah, we realize that there seems to be just a small internet break sometimes in between, so let's just proceed.
Okay. So there's always been this intention behind the relationships in the Abraham Accords, knowing that there was going to be some sort of war or tension between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That was basically a given. It just was a matter of when. So with these deepened relationships, and Gigi, as you mentioned, the fact that in the last 3.5 years, there has been a lot done in growing those relationships, not just government to government, but really having it be a people to people relationship where individuals are partnering in technology and in education, and something like 1 million Israelis have traveled to the Emirates in the last 3.5 years. It's really remarkable. So there's been this foundation that's been built in the last 3.5 years where perhaps it can withstand some of these challenges that they're now facing. Which is not to say that they are all now suddenly Team Israel. To the contrary, none have actually severed ties with Israel, but they are all deeply critical of the military operations in Gaza, which holds this really interesting tension. How can, and it's kind of beyond my comprehension, if you were to have said this 7 years ago, Arab nations are saying, we don't disagree with you, but we still value our partnership and our relationship enough to say, we're not going to sever ties with you, because there is still way more to be gained in these relationships than to throw the baby away with the bathwater because we don't agree with your military operations right now. Thinking back 5 or 7 years, that shows tremendous progress. And I mentioned this last week when I opened with just the fact that I spent a week this summer in the United Arab Emirates and in Bahrain. If you had told me that 5 years ago, I would have said, that's crazy. And to go as part of a delegation of rabbis whose goal was to celebrate these relationships and to deepen them, not on a government to government level, but really people to people, that shows, I think, why none of these ties have been severed. And then there's this question of Saudi Arabia, and a lot of people, including the Saudi government, have not yet said that normalized relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel are out of the question, even since October 7th, which is to say that there is still a lot of possibility and potential for normalized relations between Israel and her biggest neighbor that she doesn't have big relations with, which is Saudi Arabia. And the answer to why that would be the case is, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That regardless of the technological advancements and the tourist and the economic growth, all of the growth that comes from these partnerships, the real underlying thing is what Ambassador Fierstein says here, which is underlying these nations' positions undoubtedly is a view that they share with Israel, that Hamas, specifically with its Iranian backers, is a significant threat to their interests and the region at large. They recognize as well that ties to Israel enhance both their security and their economic development. So this is to say that in addition to the economy and the technology and what I might call some of the more kumbaya things, like the feel good, is the reality that even potentially with Saudi Arabia, post October 7th, there is a desire to have some sort of relation with Israel because they share a common enemy, which is Iran, which is crazy and scary. But they have multiple values. So at the same time, the Arab states have strengthened their ties to the Palestinians, pushing back on the notion that the future of the Palestinian movement is of waning interest to the broader region, which means that the Arab states are simultaneously valuing their relationship to Israel and saying we can't support Hamas because of all that they bring from Iran, and we're going to support the Palestinians. And this has always been the case. But in wartime, this takes a much deeper and more complex moment to digest, because how can you have a relationship with both sides of people who are at war? And what I think about are a lot of my millennial contemporaries who grew up Jewish, and who say, well, we support the rights of the Palestinians and we're anti-Israel. Or my favorite is we're anti-Zionist Jews, which is a whole other conversation. But it's a play that I think, honestly, the Arab nations have somehow found a deeper nuance than my millennial contemporaries who are saying that they can't support Israel in this time of war. Because what is happening here is that we're saying, actually, no, there are competing values. We're supporting the Palestinians, but to Gigi's point a moment ago, it's not like they're welcoming them into all of these Arab states, but they're trying to be supportive as much as they can, while also having the competing interest of supporting Israel and not wanting to completely dissolve that relationship that serves them so much. And where they intersect is against Hamas. And how can the Arab nations really go against Hamas and fight against Hamas? It's a very complicated situation. The latest violence has re-emphasized the need to find a political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in its entirety. There is no solution to the Gaza problem alone. There's only a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which from Ambassador Bierstein's perspective is saying that from where they're sitting, a two-state solution is a given and is really the only pathway forward. However, that's not possible right now. And so to live in an impossible space, or to be living in like a purgatory space until that potential can come, is very, very challenging. I heard from Yossi Klein Halevi, who is an Israeli journalist, and he's a scholar at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. And what he said a couple of weeks ago is the only solution is actually a regional solution. And he was calling the onus onto the Abraham Accord countries, saying that this is a regional issue, and that the countries that have formed the Abraham Accords have said these multiple values are important. And they said that when it wasn't wartime, that somehow they're going to value a Palestinian state and peace in the region. And what that means is that they're also going to value everything that Israel brings to the table, which until the year 2020 was challenging, because what the Abraham Accords did was it recognized Israel's right to exist and all that Israel brought to the table as a viable partner to the global stage. And so what Yossi Klein Halevi said is, okay, so we have these partners, and what a true partner in peace needs to do is say that the Palestinian conflict with Israel is actually a regional conflict, and one that we need the leadership of these other Arab nations to come and be leaders in what is currently the Gaza Strip. And
I'm sorry to interrupt.
no, go for it.
My question is that some of these countries that are part of the regional discussion are harboring anti-Israel terrorists, if you will, but large groups of armed people. If you're doing that, you're two-faced, because at the same time you're saying, yes, we need to have these agreements, and the only way we can come to a major agreement is through the region. But then you have to cleanse yourself, because if you don't cleanse yourself, then you're two-faced. You're not really being honest with yourself or with the world.
So what I'll say is twofold. That when we think about Israel on a map, we're thinking about this teeny tiny country about the size of New Jersey, surrounded by massive countries. And I'm not talking about Israel's relationship with Syria or Lebanon or Jordan. I'm talking about Israel's relationship with the United Arab Emirates, which is not harboring those anti-Israel terrorists. And I'm talking about the relationship with Bahrain, which is much more complicated than the Emirates, but also not harboring those anti-Israel terrorists. And the relationship with Egypt is more complicated than any of them. And the treaty with Egypt is very different in nature than what was signed by Morocco and the Emirates and Bahrain. And if we wanted to talk about what Qatar has been doing in the last 4 months, that's a whole other ballgame, because that goes into what you're saying about the two-faced. But in terms of these multiple values, I believe pretty strongly that that's not a concern in the United Arab Emirates, and I'll tell you why. The UAE is a monarchy. It is governed by the king, which has been 4 generations, and the Emirati people love the king. And it's not just because they don't have freedom of speech or freedom of expression where they have to be effusive towards the king and have a picture of the king in every single public space in the country. But they actually believe that the king has done really, really good things in the last several decades to bring the Emirates to the global stage and bring them into modernity, because it's really been on the crossroads of civilization for the last several hundred years, between the East and the West. And now things are growing at a rapid pace, and there is so much more Westernization that brings them into the conversation and into, into these technological conversations and things like the Negev forum that we'll talk about in a few minutes if we get to there. So the multiple values, I think, in a place like the United Arab Emirates are a lot simpler to understand than in other countries, because in other countries, sure, there is a whole lot of that. But in the United Arab Emirates, that group, if that group existed that you described, they would be imprisoned for many, many years. You can be imprisoned for up to 5 years in the Emirates for saying something, having one negative comment about Christianity or about Judaism.
Do they enforce it?
Yeah, they do. I mentioned this last week when I talked about my mission, but the Minister of Tolerance, who's like the second cousin to the king, he was very, very proud to tell our group that there was a woman sitting in jail right now for 5 years because she had something nasty to say about Christianity. Which goes back to big conversations about Big Brother. But yeah, and the lack of freedom of speech is very deeply enforced. There's no freedom of speech, no freedom of expression. This is what you're going to believe. And what we unpacked with some of the people who have deep understandings of what's going on in the Emirates, not in the Emirates, is that people are drinking the Kool-Aid because they've been given a much better quality of life. And so to have opportunities to engage with Israelis and to have conversations about global warming and technology and desalinization, this is bringing potential and possibility into the region that they hadn't seen, because there's money in the Emirates and there's a foundation of knowledge in Israel, and together that's a recipe for a really fruitful and rich partnership when the two leaders are saying, we're going to put aside our differences and share these values. And by and large, the average folk that has had the opportunity to partner with Israel has seen that and feels that.
But do the other Arab nations in the region respect the Emirates, and you think they're gonna, so what you're saying is you think that that relationship is gonna influence the rest of the partners in the region?
So what I'm saying is that it has to a certain degree, and, I think that it was demonstrated with the signing of the Abraham Accords, that once the UAE said, this is something we're gonna do, then more came. We're not gonna sign this with Syria. But the fact that there's even after October 7th, still conversation about the fact that normalized relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia is not off the table, even in wartime, even in this specific type of war, which is such an asymmetrical war where the PR for Israel in America is not great. So that much the more so.
Israel's PR has always been awful.
Right.
It's amazing that they do so many incredible things, whether it's medically or what, and they never do any public relations. It doesn't make any sense.
So even with all of that, the fact that there are conversations, and I was reading an article today or yesterday about how normalized relationship with Saudi Arabia, which would recognize Israel's right to exist in what many would call an existential war with Hamas, that goes to show what the value and the significance of the Abraham Accords has been. And it doesn't go unnoticed on the world stage. So there were questions about an international peace process, and one potential pathway forward is to organize an international conference to relaunch an Israeli-Palestinian peace conference, so that the Abraham Accords could be a foundation for real lasting change, even in challenging times like this. This happened in 1991 during the Madrid conference, and I'm just going to read this, which said, while the main focus of the Madrid conference was to promote peace between Israel and its neighbors, including the Palestinians, there was also a broader effort to engage the region in measures to address critical challenges, including water, environment, arms control, refugees, and economic development. So what the Abraham Accords have done is really given fuel to addressing critical challenges like water and the environment and economic development. So there's a lot of potential here. It just needs to be utilized. Yeah.
So the question I always have is, who is there left with the Palestinians to even negotiate with?
So that's a question, and this weekend I was reading that Hamas is looking to replace Sinwar, who is like the guy on top of Hamas. I don't know because I'm not deep in Israeli intelligence, but my impression of what I'm reading is that there is a lot of things that are up in the air in the Hamas leadership, and that Hamas leadership is looking to global terrorists, to other branches of the terrorists that Hamas is part of, to find new leaders that would be willing to come and be the lead terrorists of the Gaza Strip. That being said, that's part of what the primary goal is of this war right now, is to basically clean the slate of leaders so that we wouldn't be negotiating with terrorists and having a conversation about what this peace process would look like. And that's why Yossi Klein Halevi said that it would be in everybody's best interest for the Abraham Accord partners to come in and say, we're going to take over the Gaza Strip. We're going to partner with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria and come up with something that's lasting. Because the Palestinian people deserve leaders that aren't terrorists, so that those that really are not in the terrorist path can live the life that they want, which is alongside Israel, to have a state of their own. And at the same time, that can't happen when the leadership is saying our entire goal is to get rid of Israel as a country, and then we're gonna move on to the Jews. Because that's a very conflicting goal to what Israel wants, which Israel's primary goal in this war is to just maintain the right to exist, maintain their sovereignty. And I will never forget, on October 8th, I woke up and I read an article about how the IDF had planted a flag back at an army base because it had been taken over by Hamas on October the 7th. And to anybody who was challenging me, a lot of people, my contemporaries, were like, well, why are you so vocal about this? Like this, that, and the other. I said, if you don't believe that this is an existential war, I challenge you to tell me what any other reason is for the government to plant a flag on Israeli soil that was not contested soil. Like this was an army base that was not in any contested land. In any two-state solution, this would have been clearly Israel. But they had to say, no, this is our land. We are planting our flag to reclaim it.
But that's the basis, I'm sorry, but that is the basis of the conflict in a way, historically. It's their land. And I mean, historically, if you go way, way back, before Israel, before, it was Palestine as we know it, it was their land. Nobody else was, I mean, there were people on the land, certainly different people, Jews were on the land, but it wasn't per se a country. And it was taken over by heaven only knows how many other countries were there and commingled and all kinds of things. But they believe it is their country.
Right.
And they believe that the Balfour Declaration and all of that stuff should never have happened, that it was their land. So they have a right to feel that way and to express their feelings with a flag on the land, on Israel's property. Now, Israel, and to be perfectly honest, and if there's a little negativity in me, it is because Israel itself has usurped so much territory over the past, 25 years, 30 years, however, and
What territory
People are-
has Israel usurped in the last 25 or 30 years?
well, they usurped land around Gaza. They've moved their territory, if you will, closer and closer and closer to the Gaza Strip. Remembering that the land was preoccupied by Arabs, not Palestinians per se, but Arabs, different tribes lived on that land at one time. They perceive, whether rightfully or wrongfully, that that's their land. And you can't, in reality, you can't
They don't
judge
get rid
that.
of Israel. I mean, the bigger picture is
Right.
that they don't recognize Israel. I mean, it doesn't matter where they're close to
No,
Gaza.
I understand that.
It's like they want it gone. They just-
And from their perspective, going back into history, one can understand their position. You don't have to accept it, I don't, but one can understand their position. And
But-
that's all I'm saying is I can understand it.
Yeah,
The
so,
Jews there before the Palestinians.
Yeah.
right, and with
I
all,
can say that from history's point of view, not on that particular land.
well, with all due respect, if the Gaza Strip was here's where I think the history matters from in modernity. In 2005, Israel disengaged from Gaza, giving that land to the Palestinians under the pretense that that was going to be a beginning of a peaceful relationship between two nations sharing land. That was what the pretense was. And I remember being a child watching on the news as Israeli soldiers took old ladies out of their homes that they had lived in their entire life out of Gaza and put them onto buses to get them into the land of Israel. I have very, very core memories of my childhood. I was about 11 years old at the time. watching this happen, and I said to my dad, this feels wrong, like, these are their houses, this is Israel. And he said, giving them this land is a pathway forward for peace. And not a year later did that piece of land become launching ground for rockets. Not a year later was that where Gilad Shalit was taken into captivity for
5 years.
5 years. And it made the radius closer for Israel to have to fight every day for her right to exist. And one of the things that I found so miraculous about the Abraham Accords was, for the first time since her founding, there were the United Arab Emirates is one of the biggest, strongest Arab countries in the world. And she was saying Israel not only has a right to exist, but she has a right to be a partner with us. And that was more hope than I had seen in the US or in the Israeli-Arab conflict in my life. Because I was born right as I was about 1 year old when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. And that represented a loss of hope for peace in the region. And then Ariel Sharon had been moving forward, and then he got sick. And the Abraham Accords represent so much potential, because it wasn't just like what was happening with the Egyptian treaty, which was a cold peace. This was meant to be a warm, lasting peace that not only recognized the right to exist, but it was meant to grow. And so calling an international peace process is not that far off, especially from the context of, okay, now we have real partners in peace. They just don't live in the 15-kilometer strip that is just outside of some of these kibbutzim. Yes.
But how do you, if the Abraham Accords countries came in and attempted to represent the Palestinians, the non-terrorist Palestinians, how do you overcome the generations of people who have been educated in their schools that their mission is to eliminate Israel? How can you possibly overcome that? That, to me, eliminates all possibilities of a two-state solution. When these people who Hamas represents
Yeah.
And the children, the
Yeah,
5-year-old children.
exactly.
Yeah.
The 5-year-old children are now the soldiers, you know, I mean, these people have grown up
Oh, yeah.
and continue to grow up under how do you change, how can you possibly change that ideology? I mean, I just don't see that ever happening.
So it's really hard to be hopeful. And I'd say most of the time I'm not. Especially when we think back, and if you do the math to 2005, 2006, this is 18 years of Hamas being in charge. And they haven't just been in charge of the military operations, they've been in charge of the schools and the health and every facet of life in the Gaza Strip for 18 years, which means an entire generation has been born only knowing Hamas and only knowing terror. And that's an impossible thing to try to overcome. The only piece of history that I have that gives me a little bit of faith was somebody told me a story about I can't remember what the country was, but they had only learned hate as well, and they physically had to black out the hate from the school books. And that was how they taught. What?
I said it's called Florida.
You know, I think in South Africa, those kinds of things
Yes.
happen. And I think to a certain extent in post-Nazi Germany, there was a generation. But the world was willing to say that apartheid was wrong, that the Nazis were wrong. At this point, the world isn't willing to say that Israel is right and that Hamas is wrong. And I just don't understand how you can overcome, I mean, isn't there a vote today in the UN?
Yeah, and the UN is no friend to Israel, and
Well,
that's,
exactly, but that's the world stage.
yeah,
You know, I mean, whether we like it or not, and we don't like it, that's the world stage.
Right.
And it's hard to say that we can change these people's education and their mindset when the rest of the world seems to be on their side.
oh, yes, and believe it or not, I've been trying really hard, and that's part of why I brought in multiple voices, although we've only gotten through one in the last 45 minutes, because I'm trying not to bring my politics in, believe it or not. I'm really just trying to bring in other people's voices to shed some light on what the relationship between Israel and some of her neighbors, not all of them, has looked like in the last 4 months, because I think that it's important in moving forward. And it's really hard, because as you're saying, who actually are we working with? And that's part of what the challenge with the Abraham Accords has been all along, is that Israel is partnering with people around here, but it's saying you can have these relationships, and those are really important, and we know that there's a lot of value in that, but the relationship with the people in your own backyard, you're still on your own. And that's challenging. And I think that's part of why Yossi Klein Halevi, among others, is saying we need to bring in those neighboring countries to have into that conversation. Because perhaps with other Arab states, we'll have real leaders to work with. I don't know. I don't have any answers. I'm sorry to say,
Oh, no.
but I'm as
It's amazing to
perplexed
me.
as you are.
It's amazing to me that, you know, after World War II, we saw videos of the concentration camps. You couldn't help but be appalled and condemn the Nazis. But the same videos of these tunnels and these schools and hospitals that are serving as bases for the terrorists don't seem to appall anyone. The world doesn't seem to be upset by this. It's just shocking to me that there isn't more of a judgment. Outrage. And, you know, women, where's the women's movement? You know, it's just outrageous to me.
And
It's very
my,
complicated. Very
It is very
complicated.
complicated.
Social, economic, and historical, it's so complicated. That reason, sanity doesn't really answer the question. And much of it is economic at this time. The Abraham Accords, if you follow the money, it's usually economic. So when there is no economic value, the whole thing falls apart. It's very complicated. I appreciate your perspective on this and your experience on it, very much so. It's kind of like I have to let it sink in a little bit.
yeah, and it's a really hard thing to process. And I think to your question about why are people not appalled, it goes back a half an hour ago. Israel's PR is terrible. So the pictures in the tunnels are terrible, and people don't understand the gravity of what they're looking at. What they do understand is seeing people in rubble. They understand when they see people in tents. And it's hard to sort of grapple with the fact that you're looking at a picture of a tunnel with the leader of the terrorist movement moving underneath a hospital, or hearing firsthand accounts because of what was actually happening in these hospitals. That's, I think, harder to grapple with. And a number of people that I've heard from since October 7th have said that the optics are not in Israel's favor because this is such an asymmetrical war. My parents are in Israel right now, and they sent me a picture, And you wouldn't know that Israel's in war from this picture. They're there on, my dad's leading a mission trip right now, similar to what Rabbi Dan is doing. And you wouldn't know because you see the ocean, you see the buildings put together. I can only imagine what my parents are eating for dinner right now. And so there's an asymmetrical piece of that because every picture you see coming out of Gaza is dark and gray and of destruction. And the why of that is there and it's valid, but especially in a social media time, especially where a picture is worth 1,000 words, it's so much more challenging to get those 1,000 words in than to just have the 30 seconds of viewing a picture.
I just want to add, because I have kids and the younger kids that have a different perspective because they're on Instagram and all the social media, which I don't think we are as much as they are. And Israel is the perpetrator, is the colonizer, is the bad guy. They've grown up in their schools what they've been educated on is the bad guy and the good guy, and the white man is the bad guy, always. Slavery, American Indians, that's what they learn. That's what they learned in their school. Even my kids who went to private school, they came out, that's, to be champions for the underserved. And so it's, to me, that's it, that wraps it all up. It's not, the PR is that Israel is the white, even though they're not, but the white is the white man and is persecuting the Palestinians. And that's the message that they get every second, all the time, everywhere. And that's what's perfect, keeping this message going. And so those visions, like you're saying, the pictures mean nothing of Israel in tunnels because, as you just said, the rubble means much more. And all the stories of the Gazans being, hitting hospital, Israel bombing hospitals, Israel doing this, Israel doing that. There's so much more of that than anything.
Right. And they don't talk about the fact that Israel is really trying very hard to get the Palestinians out of the area that they're going to bomb or get them out of the hospital where.
Right, now that they have realized just how much is happening in this hospital in Gaza, Israel is going to great lengths to have targeted attacks within the hospital, because if that's where the bad guys are, that's the option that they've been left with. And the UN is saying, oh, the hospital is not functioning. And Palestinians went on the record yesterday or the day before saying, no, actually the hospital is still functioning. And so there is almost an element of needing to find the truth in it. And I went to Jewish day school, I went to private school, and a lot of people who are my contemporaries came out in addition, similar to seeing the black and seeing the white, seeing the good, seeing the bad, seeing the power and seeing those that are oppressed. They're saying, my Jewish education lied to me. And instead of saying there's nuance here and there needs to be nuance, they're saying, if we were only taught this one side, that must mean that this other side is the right side. And that, for me, is a big call as somebody who hopes to be teaching about Israel into the next generation, that yes, we need to be teaching Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live, and we need to be teaching Ahavat Yisrael, this love of Israel. And we need to be able to say, there are complexities to it. At the end of the day, my responsibility as a Jew is to love Israel. And we know with our family members, that's not always the easiest thing. And
I again, getting back to the public relations and the Instagram and all that. You rarely see the amount of aid that's been poured in to these areas over the generations.
Right, Israel.
And the money has been used for weapons and for tunnels
It's still.
and certainly not housing or medical advances. I mean, that's where the aid money goes, and you don't see that. I mean, you rarely see that. And that's what needs to be on Instagram. And you made it perhaps an economic comparison.
The kids don't care.
No.
Kids don't care. As far as I think.
You're from a different generation. I mean,
Well,
I've had all these conversations with so many kids and.
What, you have
it's so hard.
teenagers?
I have a 19-year-old and a 22-year-old,
Yeah.
and then my 22-year-old wants to move to Israel. I mean, she's been on so many missions with on the Diller Foundation. She's done so much with Israel, and she just had to stop watching her Instagram. She took herself off, but she's also conflicted because all of the information coming to her is, you know, it's been really hard for her. My 19-year-old he sort of stays away from the fray, but I talk with them, I talk with their friends, and it's, the information coming to them is very different from the information coming to us.
And I'm happy to talk with your daughter one-on-one, take her for lunch, take her for happy hour, whatever, and talk about how do we parse through this information? Like, I'm on Instagram, I'm perpetually frustrated with what I see on Instagram and on Facebook,
It's terrible.
and what is it, and how do we find partnership in that moment, in moments like this? And how do we filter through or find a voice to amplify what you believe? Because that voice is being amplified to the nth degree. And by the way, Iran is spending billions and billions of dollars into Instagram and TikTok and all of these things into, there's no other word than propaganda. They are creating propaganda for people my age to watch and to believe in them. And then they're paying millions and millions of dollars for bots to then respond to anything that has like a hashtag Israel, hashtag Jewish, like whatever. If your stuff's not on private, these bots, and even sometimes when it is, will find them and start attacking.
Yeah.
The internet is a scary place.
I mean, I have a friend that had just become a rabbi from New York, and when there was an issue that they were discussing, the rabbis, the young rabbis, are not agreeing so much with what's going on. They're part of that group that you were talking about,
Yeah.
that they're talking against Israel.
Yeah, I'm in the minority.
There are a lot of Jewish kids. I mean, and I'm sorry, I'm away from the what you were talking about, but there are several cases. I actually live part-time in San Francisco, and some of the private schools have, and even Jewish camps. The kids, this one is crazy.
Oh, don't even
Yeah.
get me started on it.
The kids, Jewish kids that went to this Jewish camp, which is beloved by everybody in San Francisco, the Bay Area. And these kids, even the lead signator on this letter against Israel, terrible against Israel letter, was one of my rabbi's son. So.
Tawanga had their own letter, and then, yeah,
But
that's,
it was the lead signator was Rabbi Mintz's from
Oh,
Emmanuel's son.
I know.
And she's like,
Yeah. And then there was another one from the Union for Reform. So Tawanga is a Jewish camp, but it's not in like the Reform umbrella. It's pluralistic and whatever. But under the Reform umbrella, there were people who were my campers from across the country, and a lot of rabbis, a lot of people that I grew up with, who basically were saying, shame on the Union for Reform Judaism, our umbrella, because you're not doing enough for a ceasefire. And it's really challenging because a lot of my contemporaries don't necessarily want to engage in that conversation. They want to have the microphone and not necessarily have the dialogue. And it's really hard. Not everybody.
no, but
But-
it's crazy to see, and the same thing happened at my kids' high school. There was a letter, and so many prominent members of our temple kids were on this letter, and it was just, I don't know, I had a hard time with it. I wrote to our rabbis, and like, what's happening here? Like, why does this, and these kids were in Sunday school with my kids. I mean, it's just, yeah, so it's a Jewish problem,
It
It's
is,
not just like, this pro-Palestinian, I mean, we're well represented in the movement, unfortunately.
and I want to just end with this quote at the bottom, from Ambassador, Fierstein, which is in the participation of those Arab states that have demonstrated their own commitment to living at peace with Israel, as well as their support for Palestinian aspirations to self-determination is essential. That we can have those tough conversations, and we owe it to the world to have those tough conversations across the Jewish space and with people that we agree with and with whom we don't. But the fact that one of the big takeaways from the Abraham Accords is that there are Arab states that are saying there is commitment to living at peace with Israel. That gotta provide some hope, especially in these troubling times. And I only hope that we can teach this to the next generation and that this can be fuel for many more conversations about the future of Israel and our relationship to her as Jews and looking at Israel's relationship to her neighbors. And may this year bring peace in Israel and to her neighbors. And
You're very optimistic.
Well,
I,
there has to be more rabbis like Rabbi Elana.
Very optimistic, but you know what, we all wish, but yeah, I mean, my mother is 89 and she has a different, she, she grew up in a different time than I did and.
think the people are tired.
so I'm gonna log out of the Zoom. Thank you, Aileen. Thank you to everybody who's joining via live stream, and we'll see you soon.
Next week.
There is no lunch and learn next week. I'm actually at I'm sorry, what? I'm getting